The house was too quiet, not the peaceful Sunday morning kind of quiet that Robert and I used to share over black coffee and the rustle of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. This was a heavy, suffocating silence. It was the kind of quiet that settles into the floorboards and rings in your ears, demanding to be acknowledged. It had been exactly 5 days since we laid my husband of 42 years into the Georgia clay. I stood in the center of the grand foyer, a 68-year-old woman wearing a black silk robe that felt too cold against my skin. The late afternoon sun filtered through the stained glass transom window above the heavy oak front door, casting fractured patterns of ruby and amber across the polished hardwood floors. Robert had laid those floors himself, plank by painstaking plank, back in the late 80s when we finally scraped together enough money to buy this red brick Georgian revival in Cascade Heights. For decades, this neighborhood had been a sanctuary for Black excellence in Atlanta, a place where doctors, lawyers, and business owners built their legacies under the shade of century-old magnolia trees. This house wasn't just mortar and wood. It was our monument. It was proof that we were here, that we mattered, that we had built something enduring out of nothing but grit and a pocket full of dreams. Now all I could smell was the sickeningly sweet scent of white lilies. They were everywhere. Massive, ostentatious arrangements crowding the mahogany side tables, choking the fireplace mantel, and taking over the formal dining room. The funeral home had delivered them, gifts from business associates, distant relatives, and folks who thought throwing expensive flowers at grief would somehow make it more palatable. To me, they just smelled like death. They smelled like the end of my world. I reached out, my fingers, brown, lined with age and trembling ever so slightly, tracing the edge of the entryway console table. I expected Robert to walk out of his study at any moment, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, a warm, booming laugh rumbling in his chest as he asked if I was ready for dinner. But the study door remained half open, revealing only shadows and the lingering ghostly scent of his favorite cedarwood cigar smoke. 42 years. You don't just lose a husband after 4 decades. You lose the witness to your life. You lose the man who knew how you took your tea, who knew the exact spot on the small of your back to press when your sciatica flared up, who understood the weight of your silence without demanding an explanation. Robert was a force of nature. He built Henderson Property Management from a single rundown duplex in the West End into a multi-million-dollar portfolio. He was a provider, a protector, and now I was the sole guardian of the empire he left behind. The sharp crunch of gravel in the circular driveway pulled me from my reverie. I didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. The low, aggressive purr of a leased Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon was unmistakable. It was my son, Marcus, and his wife, Chloe. I took a deep, steadying breath, smoothing the front of my silk robe and tying the sash a little tighter. A matriarch does not greet guests, even her own flesh and blood, looking defeated. I walked into the living room, taking a seat in my high-backed velvet wing chair, the one that positioned me perfectly facing the entryway. The front door opened with a click. "Mama G, you in here?" Marcus called out, his voice echoing a little too loudly in the cavernous space. "I'm in the living room, Marcus," I replied, my voice calm, smooth, and betraying none of the hollow ache in my chest. They walked in, bringing the humid Atlanta heat with them. Marcus, at 40, was the spitting image of his father, tall, broad-shouldered, with the same deep mocha skin. But where Robert wore his strength with quiet humility, Marcus wore his like a tailored suit he hadn't quite paid for. He was dressed in casual designer wear, the kind of clothes that screamed Silicon Valley tech bro on a weekend retreat. Behind him trailed Chloe. If Marcus was a man trying to look wealthy, Chloe was a woman whose entire existence was dedicated to looking flawless for the internet. She was a shade lighter than Marcus, with hair pressed bone straight and cascading down her back. Today, she wore a muted beige cashmere twin set and oversized tortoiseshell sunglasses pushed back on her head, the perfect picture of subtle, wealthy mourning. Everything about Chloe was curated, from the neutral tone of her manicured nails to the practiced look of sympathetic sorrow she plastered across her face as soon as she saw me. "Oh, Mama," Chloe cooed, her heels clicking rapidly against the hardwood as she crossed the room. She leaned down, enveloping me in a cloud of Le Labo perfume and performative warmth. "How are you holding up? We've been so worried about you." "I am managing, Chloe. Thank you," I said, politely enduring the embrace before gently pulling back. Marcus walked over, shoving his hands into his pockets. He looked around the room, his eyes darting to the crown molding, the antique Persian rug, the custom-built bookshelves. He didn't look at me. Not really. "House is quiet without Dad," Marcus noted, his tone oddly detached. "It is," I agreed, watching him closely. "Have you eaten?" Chloe asked, perching herself on the edge of the cream-colored sofa opposite me. "We brought you some salmon salads from that organic place in Buckhead. I know you shouldn't be eating heavy foods right now. Grief plays games with your digestion." I appreciate the thought. But Sister Mary from the church brought over a peach cobbler and some roasted chicken yesterday. I have plenty. Chloe's smile tightened just a fraction. She hated the church ladies. She thought their food was ghetto and bad for her macros. "Well, you need to be careful, Mama G. You're living here all alone now. A house this size. It's just so much upkeep for one person." There it was. Barely 5 days into my widowhood, and the first seed had been planted. I kept my face perfectly still. "I've managed this house for 30 years, Chloe. I believe I know how to hire a landscaping crew and a housekeeper." Of course," Marcus chimed in quickly, sensing the subtle shift in the air. "Chloe just means we worry about your safety, Ma. 3 floors, the grand staircase, all these rooms. What if you take a fall? What if someone tries to break in? This neighborhood is nice, but it's changing. My security system is state-of-the-art. Marcus, your father made sure of that," I replied, letting my gaze drift from my son to his wife. While Marcus was fumbling through his rehearsed lines of concern, Chloe's eyes were busy. I watched her gaze slide over the authentic 19th century French credenza Robert had bought me for our 20th anniversary. I saw her eyes calculate the dimensions of the original stone fireplace. And then I saw it. She thought I wasn't looking. She thought the old woman was too consumed by grief to notice. But as Marcus continued talking about the burdens of property management, Chloe casually slipped her iPhone out of her Hermes Kelly bag. Pretending to check a text message, she subtly angled the camera lens toward the dining room, snapping a photo of the open floor plan. A cold prickle of adrenaline washed over the back of my neck. "Why is my daughter-in-law photographing my house?" "We just want what's best for you," Chloe said, putting the phone smoothly back into her bag, her fake smile returning in full force. "We were actually talking to some friends at the club. They mentioned this beautiful, exclusive senior living community up in Alpharetta. Resort-style amenities, chefs, round-the-clock medical concierge. I am 68, Chloe. I am not an invalid, and I am not moving to a retirement facility," I said. The tone of my voice dropped an octave, hitting that specific register that used to make Marcus stand up straight when he was a teenager. Marcus cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "Look, Ma, let's not argue about this now. Emotions are high. We just want to make sure you're taken care of. Dad left big shoes to fill, and managing his estate. It's complicated. You shouldn't have to deal with the stress. I am quite capable of reading a bank statement, Marcus. I know, just let us help. I'm going to step into Dad's study for a minute, okay? See if I can organize some of the immediate bills so you don't have to look at them." Before I could object, Marcus was already moving down the hallway toward the heavy oak doors of Robert's sanctuary. Chloe stood up, smoothing her skirt. "I'm going to use the powder room, Mama G. I'll plate those salads for us before we leave." Suddenly, I was alone in the living room again. The air felt different now. The thick, cloying smell of the lilies seemed to mix with something else, something bitter and metallic. I didn't trust them. The realization tasted like ash in my mouth. This was my son, the boy I had carried, nursed, and prayed over. But the man who just walked down my hallway wasn't acting like a grieving son. He was acting like a vulture circling a wounded animal. And Chloe was already mentally arranging her own furniture in my living room. 15 minutes later, they were gone, leaving behind 2 overpriced plastic containers of salad on my kitchen counter. They promised to call tomorrow. They promised to handle things. I stood in the kitchen, listening to the roar of their G-Wagon fading down the street. The house was mine again. I turned away from the kitchen island and walked purposefully down the long hallway toward Robert's study. The door was ajar. I pushed it open, the hinges entirely silent. The study was exactly as Robert had left it. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with thick volumes on real estate law, history, and classic literature. The heavy leather armchair sat behind a massive mahogany executive desk. This room was Robert's command center. It was where he negotiated deals that changed the trajectory of our family's wealth. I walked behind the desk, running my hand over the smooth leather of his chair. Marcus had been in here. The stack of mail that I had left neatly on the corner of the desk had been shifted. A few stray envelopes were scattered. I sighed, reaching down to gather them. As I pulled a utility bill toward me, my fingernail caught the edge of a thick, cream-colored envelope that had been pushed, almost deliberately, half under the heavy brass base of Robert's desk lamp. I pulled it out. It was addressed to Marcus, but the address printed below his name wasn't his flashy penthouse condo downtown. It was this address. My house. I frowned, staring at the logo in the top left corner. First National Equity and Trust. Marcus hadn't lived in this house for 18 years. Why was he receiving mail here? Then I remembered. 5 years ago, when Marcus started his tech company, Nexus Innovations, he had used our home address as his initial registered business address before moving into his downtown office space. He claimed it was just for formality while he secured his commercial lease. But this envelope was new. The postmark was from 3 days ago, 2 days after Robert died. And stamped across the front in bold, unforgiving red ink were the words, "Final notice. Urgent signature required. A woman who minds her own business is a good neighbor, but a matriarch whose instincts are screaming at her to protect her family's legacy does not ignore a red flag in her own house." Without a second thought, I slid my thumb under the flap of the envelope and tore it open. Inside was a thick stack of legal documents. I unfolded them, pulling my reading glasses from the pocket of my robe and sliding them onto the bridge of my nose. The legal jargon was dense, but having been married to a real estate mogul for 4 decades, I knew exactly what I was looking at. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a slow, heavy rhythm of dread and clarity. This wasn't a standard business letter. It was a notice of default and intent to foreclose. I read the numbers. I read them twice, making sure my aging eyes weren't playing tricks on me in the fading afternoon light. But the ink was black and absolute. Marcus's company, Nexus Innovations, wasn't thriving. It was bleeding to death. The documents detailed a massive commercial loan that had been in default for over 6 months. The total outstanding debt, including exorbitant late fees and penalties, was staggering. $2.4 million. But that wasn't the part that made the breath catch in my throat. I flipped to the second page, scanning the list of collateral that the bank was preparing to seize. There were the company servers, the intellectual property patents, the downtown commercial leasehold. And then, at the very bottom of the page, listed as a secondary guarantor asset under Marcus's personal liability clause, was a line of text that made the blood freeze in my veins. Pending transfer of real property asset, 4280 Magnolia Grove Lane, Atlanta, Georgia. My house. I lowered the papers slowly, placing them flat on the mahogany desk. My hands were no longer trembling. The paralyzing, numbing grief that had wrapped around me like a heavy blanket for the past 5 days suddenly evaporated, burned away by a sudden, blinding flash of white-hot fury. They didn't want me to move into a retirement home because they cared about my hips or my safety. They didn't care about the stairs. Marcus was drowning. His fake, Instagram-perfect life with Chloe was built on a mountain of debt that was about to collapse and crush them both. He needed liquidity. He needed an asset. He needed the one thing his father had worked his entire life to own free and clear. He needed to sell my house. I looked up, my eyes sweeping across the study, resting on a framed photograph on the bookshelf. It was a picture of Robert and me on our 30th anniversary. Robert was smiling, his arm wrapped securely around my waist. He had looked at me that night and said, "Gloria, everything I build is a fortress for you. Nobody will ever move you from where you stand." I picked up the foreclosure notice, neatly folding it and slipping it into the deep pocket of my robe. My son thought I was a fragile, heartbroken widow. He thought grief had made me weak, blind, and pliable. He thought he could manipulate me out of my own legacy while the soil on his father's grave was still wet. He forgot who raised him. I walked out of the study and closed the heavy oak door until it clicked shut. The silence in the house didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like the calm before a hurricane. I walked into the dining room, grabbed the largest, most expensive vase of white lilies that Chloe had arranged on the table, and walked straight to the kitchen. Without a flinch, I dropped the vase into the stainless steel trash can. The scent of the lilies was gone. Tomorrow, I would call the family lawyer. Tomorrow, the mourning period would officially end, and the war would begin. The morning after I found the foreclosure notice, I woke up before the sun. For the first time in nearly a week, the crushing, physical weight of grief that had anchored me to the mattress was gone. In its place was a cold, razor-sharp clarity. It was the kind of clarity that only comes when you realize the people you are mourning with are the very people you need to go to war against. I didn't put on my silk robe. I dressed in a tailored navy blue slack set, the one Robert always said made me look like a board of directors' worst nightmare. I walked down the hall to his study, unlocked the heavy floor safe hidden behind the oak wainscoting, and placed the bank's foreclosure notice inside, alongside our marriage certificate and Robert's vintage Rolex. I spun the dial, locking away Marcus's $2.4 million secret. Then I went to the kitchen to make coffee. I didn't use the fancy espresso machine Chloe had bought us for Christmas 2 years ago, a machine that required an app to operate and always tasted faintly of burnt plastic. I used Robert's old French press. I ground the dark roast beans manually, the rhythmic crank, crank, crank grounding me in the present. I poured the boiling water, watching the dark bloom of the coffee rise to the surface. The house was quiet, but it was no longer a tomb. It was a fortress, and I was inspecting the walls. They didn't make me wait long. It was precisely 10:15 a.m. when the doorbell chimed. Not a knock, a brisk, impatient chime. I poured my coffee into a ceramic mug, took a deliberate sip, and walked to the front door. When I pulled it open, Marcus and Chloe were standing on the porch. The Atlanta humidity was already thick, making the morning air feel like a warm, wet towel. Marcus looked exhausted, dark circles bruised beneath his eyes, his shoulders slumped beneath a crisp linen shirt. Chloe, however, looked energized. She was practically vibrating with a manic, nervous energy, clutching a thick leather portfolio to her chest like a shield. "Good morning, Mama G," Chloe said, her voice pitched half an octave too high. "We brought pastries from that French bakery you like." She held up a small, elegant white box by its string. "Good morning," I said. Stepping aside to let them in, I didn't reach for the box. "You're out early. We have a lot to cover today," Marcus mumbled, refusing to meet my eyes as he walked past me into the foyer. "A lot of estate business to get ahead of before the probate courts get backed up." I led them into the formal dining room. The trash can in the kitchen was still full of the lilies I had thrown away the night before, and the air in the house finally smelled like lemon oil and fresh coffee again. We sat down at the long mahogany table. Robert's empty chair at the head of the table loomed like a silent judge. I sat to the right of it. Marcus and Chloe sat across from me, a united front of deceit. "So," I began, folding my hands on the polished wood, "what estate business is so urgent that it couldn't wait until the weekend?" Chloe placed the white bakery box on the table, ignoring it completely as she unzipped her leather portfolio. She pulled out a stack of glossy, high-resolution brochures and fanned them out across the mahogany surface like a dealer at a blackjack table. "We want to talk about your future, Mama," Chloe said, leaning forward, her face a mask of deep, practiced empathy. "Marcus and I were up half the night talking. We are just so worried about you being in this massive house all alone. The memories, the upkeep, the property taxes. It's going to drown you." I looked down at the brochures. The top one featured a diverse group of silver-haired actors laughing aggressively while holding glasses of iced tea on a manicured golf course. Whispering Pines, Premier Active Adult Living and Memory Care. "Memory care?" I asked, keeping my voice deadpan. Marcus winced slightly, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's a continuum of care facility, Ma. You start in an independent luxury villa, and as you get older, if your health declines, they have facilities on site to handle it. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing. They do the cooking, the cleaning. They even have a shuttle to the symphony." "I drive a Lexus, Marcus. I do not require a shuttle," I replied smoothly. I picked up the brochure by its very edge, as if it were contaminated, and dropped it back onto Chloe's side of the table. "I appreciate your sudden, intense concern for my domestic workload, but I am not moving. This is my home." Chloe's empathetic smile slipped, just a fraction of an inch, revealing the cold calculation beneath. She glanced at Marcus, giving him a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. "Your turn." Marcus sat up straighter, clearing his throat. He tried to summon the authoritative baritone his father used to command a room, but it sounded thin and reedy coming from him. "Ma, listen to me. Dad's gone. You need to be practical. The neighborhood is getting younger, the property values are peaking, and honestly, the liquid cash from selling this place would set you up comfortably for the rest of your life." "Your father and I were already set up comfortably," I reminded him quietly. Robert made sure of that. "Dad left a mess," Marcus snapped, his voice suddenly rising. The facade of the caring son cracked, revealing the panicked, drowning man beneath. "You don't know the half of it, Ma. The market's shifted. Some of his investments tanked before he died. The estate isn't as liquid as you think it is. We need to consolidate assets." Consolidate assets. It was a beautiful, sterile corporate phrase for I am $2 million in debt and the bank is coming for my neck. I leaned back in my chair, studying my son. 40 years old, wearing a $300 shirt and lying through his teeth to the woman who gave him life. I wondered briefly where Robert and I had gone wrong. Had we given him too much? Had we sheltered him from the struggle that built our own character, leaving him with an appetite for luxury but no stomach for hard work? "The house is fully paid off, Marcus," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. A Southern mother's whisper is always more dangerous than her scream. "There is no mortgage. The property taxes are paid through the end of next year. This house costs me nothing but utilities. Why are you so desperate to sell it?" "Because it's the smart thing to do," Chloe interjected, her voice sharp and nasal. The sweet daughter-in-law act was dissolving rapidly. "Mama G, you are being stubborn. We have already spoken to a premier real estate agent. She specializes in historic Cascade Heights properties. She says if we list it by the end of the month, we can spark a bidding war." I stared at her. The sheer audacity of the woman sitting at my dining table, casually discussing the liquidation of my sanctuary. "You spoke to a real estate agent about my home without my permission?" "We are trying to help you," Chloe insisted, slapping her manicured hand flat against the table. "You aren't thinking clearly. The grief is clouding your judgment. We need to move on this now. We have already put down a holding deposit on a beautiful 2-bedroom villa at Whispering Pines for you. You can take your favorite furniture, but the rest we can estate sale. We need you to pack, Mama G. We need you out in 2 weeks so the staging company can come in." 2 weeks. 14 days to dismantle 42 years of a life. 14 days to box up the kitchen where I taught Marcus how to bake his first pie. 14 days to pack away the living room where Robert and I danced to Al Green on our 25th anniversary. 14 days, so Marcus could throw my legacy into the gaping maw of his own failures. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I looked at Marcus, who was staring fixedly at a knot in the mahogany wood, entirely unable to look his mother in the eye. "Marcus," I said, my voice eerily calm, "tell your wife to lower her voice in my house. And then, I want the 2 of you to pack up your brochures and leave. I am not moving to Whispering Pines. I am not selling the house. This conversation is permanently over." I stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. But Chloe didn't move. She didn't pack up her bag. Instead, a slow, venomous smirk spread across her perfectly contoured face. It was the look of a predator who had finally cornered its prey and was tired of playing with it. "Sit down, Gloria," Chloe said. She didn't call me Mama G. She used my first name. The disrespect hung in the air, thick and foul. Marcus finally looked up, his face pale. "Chloe, don't. Let's just—" "No, Marcus. She needs to understand reality," Chloe snapped, silencing her husband with a single glare. She turned her attention back to me, her eyes hard and glittering. "You don't seem to understand the legal situation you are in, Gloria. You keep calling this your house. It's not." I remained standing. "My name is on the original deed, Chloe." "Things change," she said smoothly. She unzipped the secondary compartment of her portfolio and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. She unwound the red string closure with agonizing slowness, savoring the moment. "Robert knew you were getting forgetful. He knew a house this size was too much for you to manage. He wanted to make sure Marcus had the power to take care of you properly, without you fighting us every step of the way." She slid a document across the polished mahogany. It came to a stop directly in front of me. "What is this?" I asked, not touching it. "It's a quitclaim deed," Chloe said, her voice dripping with triumphant satisfaction. "Signed, notarized, and legally binding. Robert transferred his entire interest in this property solely to Marcus. You only have a life estate to reside here at the owner's discretion. And as the owner, Marcus is formally exercising his right to relocate you to a safer facility. You have 14 days, Gloria. Legally, we can have the sheriff's department remove you on the 15th. The room went completely silent. The only sound was the low hum of the central air conditioning. I looked down at the document. The heavy, legal-sized paper bore the official stamp of a Fulton County notary public. The legal description of the property was flawless. And there, at the bottom of the page, on the line marked grantor, was Robert's signature. Robert Nathaniel Henderson. I stared at the ink. My husband and I had signed thousands of documents together over the decades. Mortgages, leases, tax returns, report cards. I knew the loop of his R, the sharp, aggressive cross of his T, the heavy pressure he applied to the pen at the end of his last name. I leaned closer, my eyes narrowing. The signature on the paper was messy. It was shaky. The R lacked its usual confident swoop, and the H in Henderson looked jagged, almost labored. When exactly do you claim my husband signed this? I asked, my voice dangerously soft. In the hospital, Chloe said quickly, perhaps too quickly. 3 days before he passed, Marcus brought the paperwork in. Robert was very clear-headed that morning. He said, Marcus, take care of your mother. Make sure she doesn't ruin herself trying to keep up that old house. The notary was a nurse on the floor. It's ironclad, Gloria. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the sheer magnitude of their lie wash over me. 3 days before Robert died, the cancer had fully metastasized to his bones. The pain was so excruciating that the palliative care team had him on a continuous intravenous drip of Dilaudid, a narcotic painkiller 10 times stronger than morphine. 3 days before he died, my husband didn't know what year it was. He thought the heart monitor was a television set. He couldn't hold a spoon to feed himself, let alone hold a pen with enough steady pressure to execute a legal real estate transfer. The signature wasn't just shaky because he was sick. It was shaky because someone had forged it. Someone who was desperate. Someone who was facing a $2 million foreclosure and needed an asset to save their own skin. I looked at Marcus, the boy who used to hide behind my legs when it thundered. The boy Robert had taught to tie a Windsor knot in this very room. He was staring at the table, sweating profusely, chewing on the inside of his cheek. He knew I knew. Chloe, however, was beaming. She thought she had won. She thought the old woman was beaten, cowed by legal jargon and the weight of a stamped piece of paper. So, Chloe said, tapping her French manicured fingernail against the table, I suggest you take the Whispering Pines brochure, Gloria. Figure out which bedroom set you want to keep. The movers will be here on the 28th. I didn't yell. I didn't flip the table. I didn't even shed a tear. When a matriarch is betrayed in her own home, she does not give her enemies the satisfaction of her sorrow. She gives them the terror of her composure. I picked up the quitclaim deed, holding it carefully by the corners. 14 days, I repeated softly. That's right, Chloe said, zipping her portfolio closed. We'll handle the heavy lifting. You just pack your clothes and your memories. Get out of my house, I said. Excuse me? Chloe blinked, taken aback by my tone. You heard me, I said, my voice echoing off the dining room walls, carrying the full, unyielding weight of 40 years of authority. Take your brochures, take your fake pastries, and get out of my home. If you or my son step foot on this property again without my explicit invitation, I will have you arrested for trespassing. Marcus finally stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. Ma, you can't be serious. You saw the deed. You have no legal right. I said get out, I commanded, my eyes locking onto his with such ferocity that he physically took a step back. For a moment, nobody moved. The tension in the room was pulled so tight it threatened to snap and take off someone's head. Then, without a word, Marcus turned on his heel and fast-walked toward the front door, fleeing the room like a scolded child. Chloe lingered for a second, her face flushed with anger, before snatching up her leather bag. You're making a huge mistake, Gloria, she hissed. We're coming back with the sheriff. I'll put the kettle on for them, I replied coldly. I listened to the front door slam. I listened to the G-Wagon roar to life and peel out of my driveway, kicking up gravel onto the manicured lawn. I stood alone in the dining room, holding the forged deed in my hand. My son was a liar, a coward, and a thief. He was willing to throw his grieving mother onto the street to finance his own illusions. I walked over to the telephone sitting on the hallway console. I picked up the receiver and dialed a number I had known by heart for 20 years. It rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. Vance, Sterling, and Hayes. This is Arthur Vance. Arthur, I said, my voice steady and cold as ice. It's Gloria Henderson. Gloria, my dear. The old lawyer's voice softened instantly. I was going to call you this afternoon to check in. How are you holding up? I am entirely done holding up, Arthur, I said, staring at the fake signature of my dead husband. I need to see you at your office. Immediately. We have a war to win. The drive into downtown Atlanta was a blur of sun-baked asphalt and the rhythmic, hypnotic hum of my Lexus. The midday heat rose in shimmering waves off the hood of the car, distorting the sleek glass towers of the city skyline in the distance. I drove with the air conditioning on full blast, yet a cold sweat clung to the nape of my neck. On the passenger seat, inside a pristine leather folio, sat the 2 pieces of paper that threatened to dismantle my entire existence. A foreclosure notice demanding $2.4 million and a quitclaim deed bearing the forged signature of my dead husband. As I navigated the snarled traffic on Peachtree Street, a dark, insidious seed of doubt tried to take root in my mind. Did Robert sign it? I knew the cancer had ravaged his body, and I knew the dilaudid had clouded his brilliant mind in those final 72 hours. Was it possible that in a moment of drug-induced delirium, Marcus had stood over his father's hospital bed, weeping about his failures, and begged for the house? Had Robert, in a desperate, fading attempt to save our son from ruin, actually put pen to paper? No. I gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned ashen. Robert built empires. He did not surrender them to cowards. And yet, the fear remained. A tiny, vibrating frequency of terror that I might have been betrayed by the one man I trusted completely. I pulled into the underground parking garage of the steel and glass high-rise that housed Vance, Sterling, and Hayes. It was one of the oldest and most prestigious black-owned law firms in the South. Arthur Vance and Robert had pledged the same fraternity at Morehouse College in the late 70s. They had built their careers in tandem, Robert accumulating the assets, and Arthur writing the ironclad contracts that protected them. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor was silent and swift. When the polished steel doors slid open, I stepped into a reception area paneled in rich dark walnut. The receptionist, a sharp young woman who usually greeted me with a bright smile, took one look at my face and immediately stood up. Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Vance cleared his 1 o'clock for you. Go right on back. I walked down the plushly carpeted hallway and pushed open the heavy double doors to Arthur's corner office. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the city Robert and I had helped build. Arthur was standing behind his massive desk, pouring 2 glasses of sparkling water. At 70, he was a distinguished man with a neatly trimmed silver beard and the sharp, assessing eyes of a seasoned litigator. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that draped perfectly over his tall frame. Gloria, he said, his voice a rich, comforting baritone. He walked around the desk and enveloped me in a firm embrace. I am so incredibly sorry. The service on Tuesday was beautiful, but I knew the quiet afterward would be the hardest part. Sit, please. I sat in one of the leather wingback chairs opposite his desk. I didn't reach for the water. I didn't engage in the standard pleasantries. I unzipped my leather folio, pulled out the 2 documents, and laid them flat on the center of his immaculate desk. Marcus and Chloe came to the house this morning, I said, my voice steady, though my heart was beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. They gave me 14 days to pack my belongings and move into a retirement facility in Alpharetta. If I refuse, they intend to have the sheriff remove me for trespassing. Arthur stopped halfway back to his chair. He looked at me, then down at the papers. The warmth vanished from his face, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating mask of a trial lawyer. He sat down, pulled a pair of tortoiseshell reading glasses from his breast pocket, and picked up the first document. A notice of default, Arthur murmured, scanning the foreclosure papers. Nexus Innovations, $2.4 million. Good Lord. I knew the boy's tech startup was floundering, but I didn't realize he had leveraged himself into a crater. Look at the second page, Arthur, under the secondary guarantor assets. I watched as his eyes tracked down the page. He stopped. A muscle feathered in his jaw. He listed your home at Magnolia Grove. And then, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper, he produced this. I slid the forged quitclaim deed across the wood. Arthur picked it up. He read the legal description. He looked at the notary stamp. And then he spent a long, agonizing minute staring at the signature at the bottom of the page. The silence in the office was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the city traffic 40 floors below. I braced myself for the bad news. I braced myself for Arthur to tell me that the signature, however shaky, was legally binding. I braced myself for the reality of losing my home. Instead, Arthur Vance took off his glasses, set the paper down, and let out a sound that I could only describe as a dry, bitter chuckle. "Oh, Marcus," Arthur said softly, shaking his head. "You foolish, foolish boy." I leaned forward, my hands gripping the armrests of my chair. "Arthur, what is it? Did Robert sign that paper? Tell me the truth. Did my husband panic at the end and give our house to our son?" Arthur looked at me, his eyes softening with a profound, sorrowful affection. "Gloria, Robert loved Marcus, but he knew exactly who and what his son was. He knew Marcus was arrogant, fiscally reckless, and entirely controlled by a woman whose ambition vastly outweighed her common sense." Arthur tapped a manicured finger against the forged deed. "Robert didn't sign this, Gloria, not just because the signature is a clumsy forgery executed by a desperate man, but because Robert couldn't sign this." I blinked, the tension in my chest loosening just a fraction. "I don't understand." "A quitclaim deed," Arthur explained, shifting into his professional cadence, "is a legal instrument used to transfer whatever interest the grantor currently holds in a property to a grantee. You can only quitclaim what you personally own. And Robert's name was on the deed. We bought the house together, but when we refinanced in '98, it was put solely in his name for the business liability separation." "That was true," Arthur said, swiveling his chair to face the massive fireproof filing cabinet behind his desk. He unlocked it with a key from his pocket and pulled out a thick, heavily bound legal ledger. "Until 3 years ago." Arthur dropped the heavy ledger onto the desk with a solid thud. Embossed in gold lettering on the leather spine were the words, "The Henderson Family Trust." 3 years ago, when Marcus first came to his father asking for a massive capital injection for Nexus Innovations, Robert saw the writing on the wall. He saw the burn rate. He saw Chloe's lifestyle. He came to this office, sat in the exact chair you are sitting in now, and told me to build a fortress around you. Arthur opened the ledger, flipping past dozens of densely typed pages until he reached a section marked with a red tab. "We executed an irrevocable living trust," Arthur continued, turning the document around so I could see it. "Robert transferred the title of the Magnolia Grove house, along with the majority of his liquid investment portfolios and the commercial properties in Midtown, directly into the trust. He relinquished personal ownership entirely." I stared at the official county recording stamps on the pages. My name was listed at the top. "You, Gloria, are the sole primary trustee and the sole lifetime beneficiary of the Henderson Family Trust," Arthur said, his voice echoing with finality. "Robert didn't own the house when he died. The trust owns it, and you control the trust." The realization hit me like a physical wave. The breath rushed out of my lungs, and for the first time since Robert's death, tears pricked the corners of my eyes. Not tears of grief, but of overwhelming, shattering gratitude. While I had been arranging his doctor's appointments and holding his hand through chemotherapy, my husband had been quietly laying bricks, building a wall so high and so thick that not even our own son could breach it. So this deed. I pointed a trembling finger at the document Chloe had presented to me with such venomous triumph. "Is a piece of garbage," Arthur said flatly. "It is a legally impossible document. Even if Robert had been perfectly healthy and signed it in front of a dozen witnesses, it wouldn't be worth the ink it's printed on. You cannot transfer an asset you do not hold title to. Marcus and Chloe forged a document for a property that belonged to a trust they know absolutely nothing about." I fell back into the leather chair, letting the sheer absurdity of it all wash over me. They thought they had me. They had timed it perfectly, swooping in while I was blinded by grief, armed with legal jargon to terrify an old widow into submission. "He's going to lose his company, Arthur," I said, the reality of the foreclosure notice settling back in. "The bank is going to take everything. If he can't sell the house—" "Marcus's financial ruin is of his own making," Arthur said sternly, tapping the ledger. "But it gets worse for him, Gloria. Much worse." I looked up, wiping a stray tear from my cheek. How could it possibly be worse than a $2 million foreclosure? Arthur flipped to the very back of the trust ledger. Because Robert was a meticulous man, he couldn't bear to cut his son off completely while he was alive, but he refused to let Marcus's failures drain your future. Every time Marcus came crying for a bailout, the $50,000 for payroll, the $100,000 to cover the commercial lease, the down payment for Chloe's G-Wagon, Robert gave it to him from his personal non-trust accounts. Arthur pulled out a stack of promissory notes. Each one was signed by Marcus. Robert never intended to collect on these during his lifetime, Arthur explained. But he required Marcus to sign them as a condition of the money, and in the bylaws of the trust, Robert included a very specific clause. Arthur adjusted his glasses and read from the heavy parchment. Any and all outstanding debts, loans, or financial accommodations provided to my son, Marcus Henderson, during my lifetime shall not be forgiven upon my death. Instead, they shall be legally classified as an advance on inheritance. The room went deathly still. I am a smart woman, but I needed to hear the lawyer say it out loud to truly believe the magnitude of what Robert had done. Explain what that means, Arthur. Arthur took off his glasses and folded his hands. It means Marcus's designated share of the residual estate was capped at $500,000, payable only after your passing. Over the last 5 years, Robert gave Marcus exactly $620,000 in loans. Arthur leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. Marcus has already spent his inheritance, Gloria. In fact, he is in the negative. He owes the trust, which means he owes you, $120,000. He has zero claim to the house, zero claim to the investments, and he is legally indebted to your estate. A strange, unfamiliar sensation began to bloom in my chest. The crushing weight of the lilies, the suffocating silence of the empty house, the humiliation of being ordered out of my own dining room by my daughter-in-law, it all evaporated. In its place rose a cold, magnificent power. My husband had not left me as a defenseless widow. He had left me as a sovereign queen, fully armed and legally untouchable. They don't know, I whispered, a slow, dangerous smile finally touching my lips. Marcus thinks he's the executor. He thinks the will we drafted in 2005 is still the active document. He does, Arthur agreed, a matching glint of predatory anticipation in his eyes. He has no idea the trust exists, because as the creator of an irrevocable trust, Robert was under no legal obligation to inform his adult children of its creation. Chloe said they are bringing the sheriff on the 15th to forcefully evict me. Let them try, Arthur said, his voice dripping with Southern legal grit. The moment they attempt to enforce a forged deed on a trust-protected property, they cross the line from civil dispute into felony fraud. If they present that deed to a law enforcement officer, Marcus is looking at 3 to 5 years in a federal penitentiary. I stood up from the chair. I didn't feel 68 years old anymore. I felt timeless. We are not going to wait for the 15th, Arthur, I said, smoothing the front of my slacks. Arthur raised an eyebrow. What do you have in mind? I have hosted Sunday dinner at Magnolia Grove every week for the past 30 years. It is a family tradition. Marcus and Chloe have never missed one, mostly because Chloe likes to take home the leftovers. I reached over and picked up the foreclosure notice, sliding it back into my folio, but leaving the forged quitclaim deed on Arthur's desk. I want you to prepare the official trust notification documents. I want the demand letter for the $120,000 he owes the estate, and I want the legal analysis proving the deed they presented to me is a forgery. Arthur pulled a legal pad toward him, his pen poised. Consider it done. When do you want them served? I don't want them served by a process server in a parking lot, I said, my voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. I want you to join me for Sunday dinner, Arthur. 3 days from now. Bring the documents. We will serve the roast beef, the peach cobbler, and the truth. Arthur Vance smiled, a wide, brilliant smile that showed all his teeth. Gloria, it would be the honor of my career. I turned and walked out of the mahogany office, the heavy double doors swinging shut behind me. When I stepped back into the blinding Atlanta heat, the city didn't look distorted anymore. It looked clear. The mourning period was officially over. The matriarch was going to war. Sunday dinner at the Henderson house was never just a meal. For 3 decades, it had been an institution. It was the anchor of our week, a sacred convergence of family, faith, and the kind of soul-deep nourishment that cannot be bought in a restaurant. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the house was heavily perfumed with the scent of my legacy. A massive beef roast, rubbed in garlic and thyme, was resting on the butcher block. A heavy cast-iron Dutch oven sat on the back burner, simmering a deep emerald sea of collard greens flavored with smoked turkey necks. In the oven, a massive pan of 3-cheese macaroni baked until the edges achieved that perfect caramelized crispness. And cooling on the baker's rack was my signature peach cobbler, the lattice crust golden brown and bubbling with cinnamon-spiced syrup. To the untrained eye, it looked like the kitchen of a grieving widow clinging to the comfort of routine. But I was not cooking for comfort. I was preparing a final meal for the condemned. Arthur Vance arrived at exactly 3 o'clock, entering through the back kitchen door as he had done 100 times before. He was dressed in a sharp, slate-gray suit, looking less like a family friend and more like an executioner holding a polished leather briefcase. "Something smells heavenly, Gloria," Arthur said, setting his briefcase on the kitchen island. He looked around the pristine kitchen, then fixed his sharp eyes on me. "Are you ready for this?" I wiped my hands on a linen towel, my expression perfectly composed. "I have set the dining room table with the good crystal and the Royal Doulton china. If they are going to disrespect me in my own home, I will ensure they do it while surrounded by the very elegance they are trying to steal." "I have the documents," Arthur said, patting the leather case. "The trust charter, the promissory notes, the forensic analysis of the forged deed, and the cease and desist order. I also took the liberty of pulling the public filings for the foreclosure on Nexus Innovations. It's worse than you thought. Marcus isn't just losing the business. The IRS has initiated a secondary audit regarding unpaid payroll taxes." I closed my eyes for a brief second, mourning the boy who had once promised to build something great, before locking away the sorrow. Let him reap what he has sown. The heavy chime of the front doorbell echoed through the hallway. It was 3:30. They were early. I took off my apron, smoothed the front of my tailored plum-colored dress, and walked toward the foyer. Arthur followed a few steps behind, a silent, imposing shadow. When I opened the door, the sheer, breathtaking audacity of what stood on my porch almost made me laugh. Marcus and Chloe were there, but they were not alone. Standing beside them was a petite, hyper-energetic white woman with a blonde bob, clutching an iPad. Behind them, stacked neatly on the brick porch, were 10 large flattened cardboard moving boxes and 2 rolls of heavy-duty packing tape. Chloe stepped forward, bypassing a greeting entirely. "Mama G, we brought Susan. She's the premier listing agent I was telling you about." We figured since we're all here for dinner, Susan could just take a quick walk through, measure the rooms, and we can get a head start on packing up the non-essentials in the living room. Susan stepped forward, offering a blinding, veneered smile and extending a hand that I did not take. "Mrs. Henderson, so lovely to meet you. My deepest condolences on your loss. Your daughter-in-law has told me so much about this gorgeous property. The bones are just spectacular. Cascade Heights is so hot right now we can absolutely list this by Thursday." I looked at Susan. Then I looked at the cardboard boxes resting against my front door. Finally, I looked at Marcus. He was refusing to meet my eyes, staring intently at the brass porch light. "Susan," I said, my voice soft, smooth, and chillingly polite. "You are a guest. You will not be measuring anything. You will come inside, you will sit in the dining room, and you will eat. We do not conduct business until the meal is finished." Susan's smile faltered slightly, her hand dropping back to her side. "Oh, of course, ma'am. I didn't mean to intrude on Sunday dinner." "Yet? Here you are," I replied, turning my back and walking into the house. They followed me into the formal dining room. The moment Chloe stepped through the archway and saw Arthur Vance standing near the sideboard, she froze. Her designer heels stopped clicking. "Mr. Vance," Marcus said, his voice tightening with a sudden sharp edge of panic. I didn't know you were joining us for dinner." "Marcus, Chloe." Arthur nodded civilly, though his eyes were as warm as winter ice. "Robert and Gloria have always had a seat for me at this table. It seemed only fitting to be here today." Chloe recovered quickly, plastering on a bright, brittle smile. "Well, the more the merrier. Susan, this is Arthur Vance, the family's attorney. He's handling Robert's probate." "I am handling Robert's affairs, yes," Arthur corrected smoothly, pulling out a chair. "Please, sit." The dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. I served the food with the grace of a seasoned hostess. The silver clinked against the china. The crystal goblets sweated with ice water. I forced them to eat. I forced them to sit in the suffocating tension of my absolute silence. Susan, completely oblivious to the lethal undercurrents, tried to fill the void. "This crown molding is just exquisite, Mrs. Henderson. Do you know if the hardwood under the Persian rug is original?" "It is original," I said, cutting a piece of roast beef. "My husband laid it himself." "Incredible," Susan gushed, tapping on her iPad. "Buyers go crazy for authentic historical details, and since Marcus is looking for a fast, cash-only close, we won't even need to update the kitchen." Marcus choked on his water, coughing violently into his linen napkin. "Susan, maybe we can talk about the listing details later." "Nonsense," Chloe interjected sharply, her eyes darting between Marcus and Arthur Vance. She was nervous about Arthur's presence, eager to assert her dominance and legitimize her claim before the lawyer could intervene. "We are on a tight schedule. Mama G only has 11 days left to vacate. We need to sign the representation agreement today." Chloe reached into her oversized designer bag, pulled out the forged quitclaim deed, and placed it on the dining table, right next to the gravy boat. "I actually brought a copy of the deed for you, Susan, just to prove clear title so we can fast-track the paperwork," Chloe said smoothly. Susan reached for the paper, but before her fingers could touch it, Arthur Vance's large hand clamped down over the document. "I'm afraid there will be no listing agreement signed today, Ms. Susan," Arthur said. His voice was low, but it commanded the room so completely that even the clinking of silverware stopped. Susan blinked, confused. "I'm sorry? I was told Marcus was the sole owner of the property." "Psst. You were lied to," I said. I set down my fork. I picked up my linen napkin, dabbed the corners of my mouth, and placed it neatly beside my plate. The matriarch was finished playing the hostess. "Ma, what are you doing?" Marcus demanded, his voice cracking. He looked at Arthur, sheer panic finally bleeding through his arrogant facade. "Mr. Vance, I have a legally binding quitclaim deed transferring this property to me. You are interfering with my legal rights." "Your legal rights?" Arthur chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He picked up his leather briefcase from the floor and placed it squarely in the middle of my perfectly set dining table, right over the floral centerpiece. The snaps opened with a loud, violent crack. "Let us discuss reality, Marcus," Arthur said, standing up. He pulled out the heavy, gold-embossed ledger. 3 years ago, your father and I executed the Henderson Family Irrevocable Trust. The deed to this house, the Midtown commercial properties, and the bulk of the liquid investment accounts were transferred into this trust. Your father did not own this house when he died." Arthur turned his piercing gaze to Chloe, whose face had suddenly drained of all color, leaving her makeup looking like a painted mask on a corpse. "Which means," Arthur continued, "the quitclaim deed you have so brazenly placed on this dinner table, supposedly signed by Robert Henderson 3 days before his death, is a legal impossibility. He could not transfer an asset he did not own." Susan, the real estate agent, let out a sharp gasp, scooting her chair back from the table as if the paper itself had caught fire. A forgery?" "A clumsy one," I added, looking dead into Chloe's eyes. "My husband was heavily medicated on Dilaudid 3 days before he died. He could not hold a spoon, let alone apply the heavy pressure strokes evident on that document. It is felony fraud." "That's a lie!" Chloe shrieked, slamming her hands on the table. The crystal goblets rattled. "Robert signed it. He gave it to us. He knew you were losing your mind, Gloria. You're trying to steal Marcus's inheritance." "Marcus," I said, my voice cutting through her hysteria like a blade through silk. "Silence your wife before I have her removed from my property." Marcus was shaking. He looked at the heavy trust ledger, then at the forged deed under Arthur's hand, and finally at me. The tech CEO, the master of the universe, had withered into a terrified little boy. "Ma, please," Marcus whispered, the fight completely draining out of him. "You don't understand. I need the house. The company. It's not doing well. The bank is calling the loans. If I don't give them collateral, they're going to take everything." "I know exactly how your company is doing," I said. I reached into my own pocket and pulled out the thick envelope I had found in the study. I threw it across the table. It landed directly on Marcus's dinner plate, splashing slightly into the gravy. "Nexus Innovations is in default for $2.4 million, I said, reading the horror in his eyes as he recognized the bank's envelope. "You leveraged your entire life on a failing venture, And when the walls started closing in, you decided to sacrifice your mother to save your pride. You looked at the woman who gave you life, who sat by your father's deathbed, and you handed me a 2-week eviction notice. Ma, Marcus choked out, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. I was going to put you in a nice place. I swear. I just needed the equity. I'm drowning. And your solution was to drown me instead, I replied coldly. You have mistaken my grief for weakness, Marcus. Your father did not. He knew exactly what you were. He knew you were weak, easily manipulated by this woman, I gestured dismissively toward Chloe, and reckless with money. Which brings us to the final piece of business, Arthur interrupted, pulling a thick stack of promissory notes from his briefcase. He dropped them onto the table with a heavy thud. Chloe, desperately trying to salvage any piece of the wreckage, zeroed in on the papers. What is that? What else are you trying to steal from us? These are your debts, Chloe, Arthur said, his voice dripping with aristocratic disdain. Every time your husband came begging Robert for payroll injections, office rent, and luxury car down payments, Robert required a signed promissory note. Your father-in-law gave you exactly $620,000 over the last 5 years. Those were gifts, Marcus cried out. Dad said we didn't have to pay them back. He said he wouldn't collect on them during his lifetime, Arthur corrected. But in the trust charter, Robert explicitly classified these funds as an advance on inheritance. The residual estate designated for you upon your mother's passing was capped at $500,000. Arthur leaned over the table, bringing his face mere inches from Marcus's. You have overdrafted your inheritance, boy. You are in the negative. You owe the Henderson Family Trust $120,000, payable immediately. The silence that followed was absolute devastation. I watched Chloe. The performative empathy, the arrogant smirks, the aggressive posturing, it all shattered into a million jagged pieces. She stared at her husband, the man she thought was her golden ticket, and realized she was shackled to a sinking ship. They were bankrupt, they were facing felony forgery charges, and they were in debt to the very woman they had tried to throw out on the street. Susan, the real estate agent, quietly stood up. She grabbed her iPad, her face flushed crimson with sheer panic. I have to go. I am so sorry, Mrs. Henderson. I had no idea. Please don't involve my brokerage in this. I'm leaving. She practically ran out of the dining room. A moment later, the front door clicked shut. We were alone. Just family. Marcus put his head in his hands and began to sob. It was an ugly, wretched sound, the sound of a man watching his entire fabricated reality burn to the ground. Chloe sat frozen in her chair, staring blankly at the cold roast beef on her plate, her mouth slightly open, unable to process the absolute ruin of her life. I looked at them. I searched my heart for a shred of maternal pity, a desire to pull my weeping son into my arms and tell him I would fix it. But I found nothing. Robert's protection had given me the clarity to see them for what they truly were, parasites who would have smiled as they locked me in a nursing home. I stood up from the head of the table. You brought cardboard boxes to my house on a Sunday, I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. I suggest you take them to your condo. From what Arthur tells me regarding your IRS audit, you will be needing them very soon. Marcus looked up, his face stained with tears and snot. Ma, please, what are we going to do? Where are we going to go? That is no longer my concern, I said, looking down at him with the cold, immovable majesty of a queen who had just defended her throne. I am demanding the repayment of the $120,000 you owe this estate. If you cannot pay it, Arthur will place a lien on whatever assets you have left, and we will turn this forged deed over to the district attorney. Chloe finally snapped out of her shock. She stood up, knocking her chair backward onto the hardwood floor. You bitch, she hissed, her face contorted in sheer, unadulterated hatred. You're going to destroy your own son over a house? No, Chloe, I replied, my voice perfectly level. My son destroyed himself. I am simply surviving the blast radius. I pointed toward the hallway. Get out of my house, and if either of you ever step foot on my property again, I will not call the lawyers. I will call the police. They didn't argue. They didn't threaten. They had been entirely stripped of their weapons and their illusions. Marcus stood up on shaking legs. He didn't look at me. He walked past the table, his shoulders hunched, looking 20 years older than when he arrived. Chloe followed him, leaving her untouched peach cobbler and her fake smiles behind forever. Arthur and I stood in the dining room, listening as the heavy oak front door opened and closed. We listened as the leased G-Wagon started up, the engine lacking its usual aggressive roar, and pulled out of the driveway for the last time. Arthur let out a long, heavy breath, reaching down to close his briefcase. Well, that was certainly one of the more eventful Sunday dinners I've attended. I looked at the table. The crystal was still sparkling. The roast beef was still warm. The house was quiet again, but this time it was a magnificent, peaceful quiet. The shadows were gone. "Sit down, Arthur," I said, pulling my chair back in and picking up my fork. "The cobbler is getting cold, and we have a lot of work to do tomorrow." For 3 days following the Sunday dinner, Magnolia Grove was a sanctuary of absolute, uninterrupted peace. The heavy, oppressive energy that Marcus and Chloe had brought into my home had been excised, scrubbed clean like a bloodstain from the hardwood. I spent my mornings in the sunroom, drinking black coffee and watching the cardinal birds dart through the ancient branches of the oak trees in the backyard. I was mourning, yes. The ache of Robert's absence was a physical hollow in my chest, a phantom limb that throbbed when I reached for him in the middle of the night, and I mourned the son I thought I had raised. But beneath the grief lay a bedrock of profound security. Robert had built my fortress, and I had successfully defended the gates. I thought the war was over. I thought that by exposing their forgery and demanding the repayment of their debts, I had broken their spirit. But I had underestimated the sheer, desperate venom of a cornered parasite. A wounded animal will run to save its life, but a parasite, once detached from its host, will do anything, no matter how abhorrent, to sink its teeth back into the flesh before it starves. It began on a Thursday morning beneath the deceptively bright and cloudless Atlanta sky. I had decided to host a small luncheon for the ladies of the church bereavement committee to thank them for their support during the funeral. I drove my Lexus down to a premium grocer in Buckhead, intent on purchasing a selection of imported cheeses, fresh figs, and a specific cut of wild-caught salmon. Walking through the air-conditioned aisles, selecting the finest produce, I felt a familiar sense of control returning to my life. I was Gloria Henderson. I was a woman of means, of standing, and of impeccable taste. I brought my carefully curated basket to the checkout lane. The cashier, a polite young man with a bright green apron, rang up the items. "That will be $247, Mrs. Henderson." He smiled, recognizing me as a regular. I opened my leather wallet and extracted my platinum bank card, the primary checking account linked to the Henderson Family Trust, which carried a balance that most people wouldn't see in a lifetime of labor. I tapped the card against the reader. A sharp, unpleasant beep echoed from the machine. The cashier frowned, looking at his screen. "I'm sorry, ma'am. It says declined." Sometimes the chip reader gets a little finicky. Let's try inserting it. I felt a faint prickle of annoyance, but nothing more. I inserted the card. The machine paused, thinking, before emitting the same harsh beep. The screen flashed in bold red letters. Declined. Contact institution. "That's impossible," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Run it again." "Ma'am, it's giving me a hard decline code," the young man said, his voice dropping an octave, trying to spare me embarrassment as the line behind me began to grow. "Do you have another card?" I pulled out my secondary credit card, one registered only in my name, and handed it to him. He swiped it. Beep. Declined. A cold, creeping numbness started at the tips of my fingers and slowly crawled up my arms. The ambient noise of the grocery store, the soft jazz over the speakers, the beep of the registers, the chatter of shoppers seemed to warp and muffle. It wasn't an issue with a chip. It wasn't a bank error. I left the groceries on the counter, ignoring the confused stares of the cashier and the people in line, and walked out of the sliding glass doors into the sweltering Georgia heat. I got into my car, locked the doors, and pulled out my phone. I opened my banking app tab. Where there should have been a 6-figure liquid balance, there was only a gray screen with a single line of text. Account restricted. Please contact your branch administrator. I didn't drive home. I put the car in drive and sped directly to the First National Equity and Trust branch in Midtown. When I walked through the heavy glass doors of the bank, the familiar elegance of the marble floors and mahogany desks offered no comfort. I marched straight past the teller line to the glass-walled office of Helen Carmichael, the the branch manager who had handled Robert's and my accounts for over a decade. Helen looked up from her computer as I opened her door. The moment she saw my face, all the color drained from hers. She didn't offer her usual warm smile. She looked terrified. "Gloria," she whispered, quickly standing up and closing the blinds to her office. "You shouldn't be here." "Helen, my cards were just declined at the grocery store. My app says my accounts are restricted. I need you to lift the freeze immediately. If this is some sort of fraud alert." "It's not a fraud alert." "Gloria," Helen said, her voice shaking slightly. She didn't ask me to sit down. She moved behind her desk as if using it as a shield. I can't speak to you about the accounts. I am legally prohibited from discussing the Henderson family trust with you." I stared at her, the sheer impossibility of her words hanging in the air. "I am the sole primary trustee and beneficiary. You will speak to me, or I will have Arthur Vance hollow out this branch." Helen swallowed hard, tears welling in her eyes. "Gloria, please understand. Our legal department received a court order at 8 a.m. this morning. It's an ex parte emergency injunction from the Fulton County Probate Court." The air in the room suddenly felt entirely devoid of oxygen. "An injunction for what?" Helen's voice dropped to a terrified whisper. "An emergency conservatorship, Gloria. Your accounts aren't frozen. They have been legally transferred. The court has temporarily stripped you of all fiduciary and personal financial control." "Transferred to whom?" I demanded, though the dark, sickening truth was already blooming in the pit of my stomach. "To your court-appointed temporary conservator," Helen said softly. "To Marcus." I didn't scream. I didn't faint. The matriarch in me locked my spine into place, but inside, the world was spinning violently off its axis. I turned on my heel and walked out of the bank. I don't remember the drive to Arthur Vance's office. I only remember the blinding white rage that had entirely eclipsed my fear. When I burst through the double doors of Arthur's corner office, he was already standing, his suit jacket discarded on a chair, a massive stack of legal documents spread across his desk. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "I know," Arthur said before I could even open my mouth. "The probate court notified my office 20 minutes ago. I have been reading the petition." I walked to his desk, gripping the edge of the polished wood so hard my knuckles ached. "Arthur, tell me how my son, who forged a deed and owes this trust over $100,000, just legally stole my money." "He didn't steal your money, Gloria," Arthur said grimly, picking up a thick, stapled document. "He stole your mind. He stole your legal personhood." Arthur gestured for me to sit down. I refused. I needed to stand. I needed to feel the ground beneath my feet. "Explain it to me," I commanded. Arthur let out a heavy sigh, adjusting his glasses. "It's a conservatorship. In Georgia, if a family member believes an adult is incapacitated, meaning they lack the mental capacity to make significant responsible decisions concerning their health or finances, they can petition the probate court to appoint a guardian and a conservator." "I am 68 years old, Arthur. I manage a multi-million-dollar estate. I am perfectly sane." "I know that, but the court operates on the evidence presented to it," Arthur said, tapping the petition aggressively. "Marcus and Chloe bypassed the standard procedure, which requires a hearing in your presence. They filed for an emergency ex parte order. They told a judge that you were in immediate, life-threatening danger and that you were actively destroying the family's assets." "How?" I spat the word out like poison. How could a judge believe that without ever seeing me? Arthur turned to the second page of the document. Because they didn't just walk in with a story. They walked in with a sworn medical affidavit. He handed me a piece of paper. It bore the letterhead of a private, high-end psychiatric concierge service in Buckhead. At the bottom was the signature of a Dr. Elias Thorne. I scanned the medical jargon, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. Patient exhibits severe, acute grief-induced psychosis, profound paranoia and delusions of persecution directed at immediate family members. Early-onset dementia exacerbated by trauma. Patient is actively hallucinating, claiming to receive legal and financial instructions from her deceased husband. Patient exhibits violent outbursts and erratic financial behavior, posing an immediate threat to the preservation of the estate. "Who is Dr. Elias Thorne?" I asked. my voice trembling with a rage so profound it felt like an earthquake in my chest. I have never met this man in my life. He's a hired gun, Arthur said in disgust. He caters to wealthy families looking to quietly institutionalize problematic relatives. Chloe's country club connections, no doubt. He based this entire evaluation on eyewitness testimony provided by Marcus and Chloe and a supposedly erratic phone call they recorded of you. The Sunday dinner, I realized, the pieces snapping together into a horrifying picture. They twisted the Sunday dinner. Arthur nodded slowly. They told the judge that you invited them over, hallucinated that Robert was sitting at the table, threw a plate of food at your son, and began burning legal documents in the dining room while screaming about conspiracies. They claimed the trust you spoke of was a paranoid delusion. The sheer diabolical brilliance of Chloe's plan left me breathless. They couldn't beat the trust with a forged deed, so they changed the battlefield. If Gloria Henderson was the sole trustee, the only way to gain access to the millions was to legally declare Gloria Henderson a mental incompetent. As my temporary conservator, Marcus now had the legal authority to act on my behalf. He could access the accounts. He could pay off his $2.4 million debt with my money. And worse. The conservatorship, I whispered, looking up at Arthur. It's not just the money, is it? Arthur looked at me with deep, profound sorrow. No, Gloria. They petitioned for both conservatorship of the estate and guardianship of the person. The judge granted temporary emergency powers for both. What does that mean? Arthur took a step closer to me. It means Marcus has the legal authority to determine where you live. He has the authority to make all your medical decisions. He has the authority to authorize psychiatric medicating. Arthur picked up the final page of the court order. The judge has authorized a temporary, involuntary psychiatric hold for evaluation. Marcus has already signed the admission papers for the locked memory care ward at Whispering Pines. The room tilted. The air conditioning in Arthur's office suddenly felt like the freezing chill of a morgue. They weren't just going to take my house. They were going to take my freedom. They were going to lock me in a sterile white room with strangers who couldn't remember their own names. They were going to drug me until I actually became the drooling, incapacitated woman they claimed I was on paper. They would erase me from the world, liquidating Robert's empire to fund their lavish, hollow lives, all while playing the tragic, loving children who had to make the hard choice for Mama's own good. It was a fate worse than death. It was the total annihilation of dignity. They are coming for you, Gloria, Arthur warned, his voice urgent. An emergency order like this. Marcus can show up at Magnolia Grove with private medical transport and the local police to enforce the order. If you resist, they will use it as further proof of your erratic, violent psychosis. They will strap you to a gurney. For a moment, the terror threatened to break me. The image of being dragged from the home Robert built, screaming and fighting against men in uniform who looked at me with pity instead of respect, flashed behind my eyes. Chloe had orchestrated the perfect trap. But Chloe made one fatal miscalculation. She assumed that taking a black woman's money would break her spirit. She forgot that my spirit was forged in fires far hotter than a Fulton County probate court. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I closed my eyes, summoning the absolute, unyielding core of who I was. I was Gloria Henderson. I survived the civil rights era in the Deep South. I built an empire from the ground up alongside a man who worshipped the ground I walked on. I would not be put in a cage by a mediocre son and a vapid, venomous daughter-in-law. When I opened my eyes, the terror was gone. Only the matriarch remained. Arthur, I said, my voice eerily calm, ringing with the absolute clarity of a general surveying a battlefield. I am not going back to Magnolia Grove today, and I am certainly not going to Whispering Pines. Good, Arthur said, visibly relieved. I have a secure private residence outside the city limits where you can stay. My name isn't on the deed, and it's entirely off the grid. They won't find you there. We have 5 days until the mandatory evidentiary hearing to challenge the temporary ex parte order. We need to prepare. We are going to do more than prepare, Arthur, I said, leaning over his desk, my eyes locking onto his. We are going to annihilate them. I want Dr. Elias Thorne's medical license stripped and a subpoena for his financial records. I want to know exactly how much Chloe paid him for that fake affidavit. I want the security camera footage from my dining room from Sunday, proving exactly what happened. And I want an independent, comprehensive psychiatric evaluation from the Chief of Psychiatry at Emory University Hospital, conducted tomorrow morning. Arthur grinned, a fierce, predatory smile. I'm already drafting the motions, Gloria. When we walk into that courtroom on Tuesday, Marcus and Chloe won't know what hit them. No, I corrected him softly. When we walk into that courtroom, I want them to know exactly what hit them. They wanted to play a game of mental competence, Arthur. Let's show them what a fully competent, fully enraged mother is capable of. I picked up the forged medical affidavit, folded it neatly, and placed it in my purse. The battle for the house was over. The battle for my soul had just begun. The Fulton County Courthouse always smelled of lemon floor wax, old parchment, and the distinct metallic scent of desperate people. It was Tuesday morning, exactly 5 days since Chloe and Marcus had tried to legally erase me from the world. I did not arrive looking like a heartbroken widow, and I certainly did not arrive looking like a woman suffering from grief-induced psychosis. I wore a tailored, double-breasted cream wool suit, a piece Robert had commissioned for me in Milan a decade ago. At my throat was a simple strand of South Sea pearls. My hair was impeccably styled, my posture ruler straight. I looked exactly like what I was, the sole trustee of a multi-million-dollar empire. Arthur Vance walked beside me, his leather briefcase swinging with the heavy rhythmic cadence of an executioner's axe. When Arthur pushed open the heavy oak doors to courtroom 4B, the ambient chatter immediately died. Marcus and Chloe were already seated at the petitioner's table. They had clearly coordinated their wardrobe for the performance of a lifetime. Marcus wore a subdued navy suit, his shoulders slumped to project the image of a son burdened by a tragic familial duty. Chloe wore a high-necked black dress, clutching a wad of tissues, her face devoid of its usual heavy contouring to make her appear pale and exhausted by worry. They expected the bailiffs to wheel me in from the locked psychiatric ward of Whispering Pines, heavily sedated and confused. When Chloe looked up and saw me striding down the center aisle, flanked by one of the most feared litigators in Georgia, the tissue slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the floor. The color drained from her face so fast I thought she might actually faint. Marcus's jaw dropped, a low, strangled gasp escaping his throat. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. I did not look at them. I took my seat at the respondent's table, crossing my ankles, and rested my hands gracefully in my lap. The bailiff called the room to order, and the Honorable Judge Eleanor Hastings took the bench. Judge Hastings was a formidable black woman in her early 60s, known for her brilliant legal mind and an absolute zero-tolerance policy for courtroom theatrics. She adjusted her reading glasses, looking down at the thick file before her. We are here for the evidentiary hearing regarding the emergency temporary conservatorship and guardianship of Gloria Josephine Henderson, Judge Hastings began, her voice echoing with authority. Let the record reflect that the respondent, Mrs. Henderson, is present. Counselor Vance, I see you have filed a motion to vacate the ex parte order. I have, Your Honor, Arthur said, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. Not only to vacate the order, but to request immediate sanctions against the petitioners for perjury, the filing of fraudulent medical documents, and attempted grand larceny. The opposing counsel, a slick, nervous-looking attorney Chloe had clearly hired for his willingness to bend the rules, shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This is an outrageous mischaracterization. My clients acted out of deep concern for a mother who is suffering from severe psychiatric decline. Save your breath, Counselor, Judge Hastings snapped, holding up a hand. She turned her sharp gaze to Arthur. Mr. Vance, those are heavy accusations. You had better have the evidentiary weight to back them up. I brought an anvil, Your Honor, Arthur replied smoothly. Arthur approached the bench, handing the bailiff a thick, bound dossier. Exhibit A, Arthur announced, turning slightly so Marcus and Chloe could hear every word. An independent, comprehensive psychiatric and neurological evaluation of Mrs. Henderson, conducted yesterday morning by Dr. Eris Thorne, no relation to the petitioner's doctor, who happens to be the chief of psychiatry at Emory University Hospital. The evaluation includes a full cognitive panel and an MRI. Mrs. Henderson is not only entirely sane, but she tests in the top 1 percentile of cognitive function for her age. I watched Marcus swallow hard, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically. Furthermore, Arthur continued, his voice rising, filling the courtroom with righteous thunder, regarding the affidavit submitted by Dr. Elias Thorne, claiming Mrs. Henderson was actively hallucinating, My office served Dr. Thorne with a subpoena for his communications and financial records with Chloe Henderson. Upon receiving this subpoena, Dr. Thorne invoked his Fifth Amendment rights, withdrew his affidavit, and voluntarily surrendered his medical license to the state board this morning to avoid a federal wire fraud investigation. The courtroom was dead silent. Chloe's breath was coming in short, panicked gasps. Her expensive attorney was staring at her with wide, horrified eyes, realizing he had been used to perpetrate a felony. Your Honor, the petitioners claimed my client had a violent psychotic break during a family Sunday dinner, Arthur said, pacing slowly in front of the tables. They claimed she threw plates, burned documents, and hallucinated a trust that did not exist. Fortunately, Mrs. Henderson's home is equipped with a discreet, voice-activated interior security system, installed 2 years ago to monitor her late husband's mobility. Arthur pulled a sleek silver flash drive from his pocket and handed it to the clerk. Exhibit B high-definition audio and video of the Sunday dinner in question. It will clearly show that Mrs. Henderson was perfectly composed. It will also show Chloe Henderson presenting a quitclaim deed with a forged signature, attempting to illegally evict Mrs. Henderson from a property owned by an irrevocable trust. Judge Hastings's face hardened into a mask of pure judicial wrath. She looked at Marcus and Chloe not as citizens, but as criminals. "Counselor," Judge Hastings said, her voice dangerously quiet as she addressed Chloe's lawyer, "is there any reason I should not immediately remand your clients into the custody of the Fulton County Sheriff's Department for felony forgery, perjury, and elder abuse?" The opposing lawyer frantically packed his briefcase. "Your Honor, I was entirely unaware of the fraudulent nature of these documents. I withdraw as counsel for the petitioners, effective immediately." He didn't even look at Marcus as he practically ran down the aisle and out the door. Marcus put his head on the table, burying his face in his arms. The golden boy, the tech CEO, reduced to a weeping, broken shell. Chloe sat frozen, her eyes darting wildly around the room, looking for an exit, looking for a loophole, looking for anything to save her from the steel jaws of the trap she had built for me. "Bailiff," Judge Hastings said, reaching for her gavel. "Your Honor," I said. It was the first time I had spoken since entering the courthouse. My voice was calm, rich, and completely steady. I stood up, smoothing the front of my cream suit. Judge Hastings paused, her hand hovering over the gavel. "Mrs. Henderson, you have the floor." "I have no desire to see my son go to a federal penitentiary," I said, looking directly at Marcus. He lifted his head, his tear-streaked face blooming with a sudden, pathetic glimmer of hope. "Prison is funded by the taxpayers, Your Honor, and frankly, the taxpayers of Georgia should not have to foot the bill for his housing and meals. He owes a debt, and I intend to collect it myself." Arthur Vance pulled a final document from his briefcase, a thick contract bound in dark blue leather, and walked over to Marcus's table. He dropped it in front of my son with a heavy, satisfying thud. "As you know, Your Honor, Marcus Henderson's company, Nexus Innovations, is currently in default on a $2.4 million commercial loan," Arthur explained to the court. "Yesterday afternoon, acting as the sole trustee of the Henderson Family Trust, my client purchased that distressed debt from First National Equity for pennies on the dollar. The trust is now the sole primary creditor of Nexus Innovations." Chloe gasped, finally realizing the sheer, crushing magnitude of what I had done. "That is a corporate restructuring agreement," I said, looking down at the boy I had raised. "The Henderson Family Trust is executing a hostile takeover of Nexus Innovations. Marcus, you will remain the CEO in title. You will go to work every day. You will sit in your glass office, but you will own 0% of the equity. 80% of your executive salary will be legally garnished and deposited directly into the trust until the $120,000 you stole from your father is repaid with interest. I own your debt. I own your company. I am your boss, Marcus. And if you miss a single day of work, if you fail to meet the quarterly projections Arthur has laid out in that contract, I will liquidate the company, seize your personal condo, and then I will hand the Sunday dinner footage over to the district attorney." The brilliance of this punishment settled over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. I wasn't just taking his money. I was taking his pride. I was forcing him to wake up every single morning and work tirelessly for the mother he had tried to throw away. "And Chloe," I said, turning my gaze to my daughter-in-law. She flinched as if I had struck her. "You married Marcus because you wanted a life of luxury funded by his success. Now you are married to an employee of the Henderson Family Trust, an employee who will be living on a strictly garnished middle-class budget for the next 10 years. There will be no more G-Wagons, no more country club memberships, no more imported cashmere. I tilted my head, offering her a cold, razor-sharp smile. I suggest you learn how to clip coupons. Chloe looked at the contract on the table. She looked at Marcus, who was sobbing silently, his hands trembling as he reached into his breast pocket for a pen. She didn't comfort him. She didn't hold his hand. The illusion of their partnership shattered the moment the money vanished. Without a word, Chloe picked up her designer bag, turned on her heel, and walked out of the courtroom, her heels echoing hollowly against the wood floor. She left him there, entirely alone in the wreckage of his own making. Marcus signed the document. His tears stained the blue ink. Judge Hastings watched the entire exchange in profound silence. When Marcus handed the signed contract back to Arthur, she let out a slow breath. The petition for conservatorship is dismissed with extreme prejudice, Judge Hastings declared, striking her gavel. Mrs. Henderson, you are a formidable woman. May God bless your late husband's memory. He already has, Your Honor, I replied. That evening, the Georgia sun began its slow, golden descent behind the ancient magnolia trees that lined my backyard. The sky bruised into spectacular shades of violet and crushed orange. I sat on the sweeping back porch of Magnolia Grove. I was out of my tailored suit, wearing a comfortable linen dress, the fabric breathing perfectly in the humid evening air. In my hand was a crystal glass filled with iced sweet tea, a sprig of fresh mint from my garden resting against the rim. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the suffocating, heavy silence of the days immediately following Robert's funeral. It was a magnificent, sovereign peace. It was the sound of a kingdom at rest. The cloying scent of the funeral lilies was completely gone, banished from my home forever. In its place, the evening breeze carried the sweet, earthy perfume of the magnolia blossoms and the faint ozone promise of a coming summer rain. Marcus had called my phone an hour ago. I watched his name flash across the screen. Then I pressed a button and sent him straight to voicemail. He had a long road of labor and humility ahead of him before he earned the right to hear his mother's voice again. Perhaps in 5 years or 10, when he had paid his debts and learned the true weight of $1, I would invite him back for Sunday dinner. But until then, he was just an employee. I took a slow sip of the sweet tea, the ice clinking musically against the crystal. I looked out over the manicured lawn, thinking of Robert. I thought of the man who had looked at his family, recognized the rot festering in his own son, and spent the final years of his life meticulously building a legal fortress to shield me from the fallout. He had loved me enough to ensure I would never be at the mercy of anyone's greed. He had given me the ultimate gift, the absolute freedom to be the author of my own conclusion. They thought they could erase a 68-year-old black woman because she was grieving. They thought I was a relic, a stepping stone on their path to unearned wealth. They forgot that the roots of this house and the roots of my spirit ran deeper than their petty ambitions could ever reach. I placed my glass on the wicker side table and leaned back in my chair, listening to the cicadas begin their evening symphony. I was Gloria Josephine Henderson. I was safe, I was independent, and I was exactly where I belonged.